I want to tell you something before I get into any of this. I am not a soldier. I never was. I'm an archivist, a note-taker, the kind of person who gets assigned to summit events because I have neat handwriting and I don't ask uncomfortable questions. My supervisor used to call me the most forgettable necessary person in any room, and I took that as a compliment because it meant I got to watch everything without anyone watching me back. That's how I ended up at Orinthia Station on the morning the galaxy almost ended. Not metaphorically. I mean the morning when 7 of the 12 galactic powers were gathered in one pressurized chamber 32,000 kilometers above a dead moon, when the temperature inside the summit hall was a carefully calibrated 19.4 degrees Celsius, when the snack arrangements had been argued over for 11 months because the Velthri Dominion considers cooked food a form of aggression, and when a woman named Sergeant First Class Mara Akoy stood between 200 dignitaries and a very specific kind of death. I'll tell you about the death in a moment. First, let me tell you about the station. Orinthia Station was not built for humans. It was built by the Gloran Collective, which is the polite name for a civilization of beings who communicate through resonance frequencies in the low-end acoustic range and who find corridors comfortable at approximately 2 meters wide and 4 meters tall. Everything was proportioned slightly wrong for a human body. The door frames were too tall. The seats were too deep. The lighting was a pale amber violet that the Gloran finds soothing and that most humans describe as the color of a headache. I arrived 3 days before the summit proper, part of the advanced documentation team. There were 9 of us humans in total attached to the Earth Accord delegation. 2 senior diplomats, 3 aides, 2 security analysts, me and Mara. Mara was the last to board the shuttle at the Nairobi Orbital Transit Hub. I noticed her because of how she boarded. Everyone else came through the gate with luggage, with tablets, with the kind of frenetic energy that comes from being important and knowing you're important. Mara came through with one bag, a sealed carry case that I would later learn contained her equipment, and a stillness about her that was almost physical, like she was a different density than everyone around her. She wasn't tall, which surprised me when I learned what she did for a living. I'd built up an image of human bodyguards from old feeds, broad shoulders, permanent scowl, the look of someone who bench presses shuttle engines for fun. Myra was maybe 168 in height. She had a runner's build, the kind you get from years of moving quickly in bad situations rather than lifting heavy things in comfortable ones. Her hair was natural, cut short, and she had a habit of tilting her head very slightly to the left when she was listening to something that didn't sit right with her. I know about that habit because over the next 3 days I watched her tilt her head approximately 63 times. I counted, old archivist habit. She was assigned as personal protective detail for Ambassador Selene Mwangaford, Earth's lead negotiator. Ambassador Mwangaford was 61 years old, former professor of xenolinguistics, and one of maybe 12 humans alive who could hold a productive conversation with a Velthri delegate without requiring chemical sedation afterward. She was also, and I say this with deep professional respect, absolutely terrible at accepting that she might need protection. "I've been doing this for 20 years, the ambassador told Mara on the first morning, in the tone you use when you want someone to understand that they are unnecessary. "I've navigated Gloran diplomatic corridors. I've attended Velthri resonance ceremonies. I once spent 6 hours in a sealed room with a Cathari clan leader who wanted to absorb my memories. I am fine." Mara listened to all of this with that particular head tilt. Then she said, "Yes, ma'am, I'll stay out of your way." And she did. That was the thing about Mara that I didn't understand until later. She stayed out of everyone's way. She mapped the station in the first 12 hours. I know because I happened to be in the corridor archive room, and I watched her pace the same sections of hallway 3 times, stopping at junctions, looking at the ceiling, checking her positioning relative to exits. She ate in the secondary commissary where the Gloran staff ate, not with the human delegation, because from there she had line of sight to 4 different approach corridors. She slept, as far as I can tell, approximately 4 hours per night, in a room she had personally inspected and cleared before accepting. I asked her once, on the second evening, why she'd joined protective detail for Galactic summits specifically. It seemed like the hardest version of an already hard job. She looked at me for a moment with those dark, very level eyes, and she said, "Because the people in these rooms make decisions that affect billions of humans. And most of the other beings in these rooms have never once thought about what a human being is actually capable of. I wrote that down, old archivist habit. I didn't understand it fully until the third day. The summit opened on what the Orinthian station calendar marked as day cycle 47, which corresponds to a Tuesday, because of course it does. The most important political gathering in a generation happened on a Tuesday. The summit hall was a masterwork of Gloran architectural philosophy, which means it was enormous, subtly curved, and made you feel simultaneously significant and irrelevant. The ceiling arched 50 meters above the central table. The table itself was a single piece of Viridian black stone, a gift from the Cathari mineral kingdoms, and it was nearly 40 meters long, surrounded by delegation platforms that had been individually calibrated to each species' comfort requirements. The Earth delegations section had standard chairs, which the Gloran had sourced from a human furniture catalog and assembled incorrectly, so the seats tilted 2 degrees to the right. Not enough to be obviously wrong, just enough to make you feel slightly off balance for hours. Mara noticed it the moment we sat down. She said nothing, but she shifted her chair away from the table by 6 centimeters, which I realized later meant she could stand without the table blocking her movement. I was positioned at the archive desk behind the main delegation seats, close enough to hear, far enough to be invisible. My job was to record, timestamp, and cross-reference everything said in that room. I had 4 separate recording devices and a manual notation system as backup. The Galactic Council does not trust single points of failure. Neither do I. The delegations arrived in protocol order. The Velthri came first, 7 of them, wrapped in their environmental suits, the kind that pump exactly the right atmospheric mixture for a species that breathes something that would liquefy a human lung in 40 seconds. They moved the way they always move, which is to say in a way that suggests they're not entirely convinced that physical space applies to them. Their lead delegate was High Resonator S. Siveth, who had the approximate diplomatic warmth of a dying star. The Gloran followed, then the Cathari, who came with their own stone seats, which they assembled themselves, which took 20 minutes, which nobody commented on because you do not comment on Cathari customs unless you want to become a diplomatic incident. Then the Faranath Assembly, then 2 species I'd only read about in xenology briefings, the Oran Spiral Collective and the Dominion of Vale. And finally, with a formality that felt slightly theatrical, the Overlord delegation of the Scarith Imperium. I want to stop here and explain the Scarith because they matter. They matter enormously. The Scarith Imperium was not one of the original founding powers of the Galactic Council. They'd been admitted 11 years prior, after a period of what the Council called expansion negotiations, and what most of the species who'd been on the receiving end called being absorbed by a more powerful neighbor. The Scarith were tall, averaging 2.6 meters, with a bilateral symmetry that was almost, but not quite, human-like, and a plating system along their dorsal surface that could harden to approximately the same tensile strength as reinforced alloy under stress. Their eyes were compound, like an insect's, but they registered light across a spectrum that included near-ultraviolet, which meant they could see things in that room that most other species couldn't. They were also, and this is the part that mattered most, profoundly convinced of their own superiority. Not in the aggressive way that makes other species nervous. In the quiet, absolute way that makes them dangerous, because it means they don't feel the need to prove it. They simply act from a place of certainty that they are the most significant beings in any room they enter. Their lead delegate was called Overlord Prime Verk Salis. He had 8 subordinates. 4 of them were what the Scarith called resonance soldiers, their protective detail, armed with Scarith pulse equipment that could, according to the security briefing I'd read the night before, liquefy a standard kinetic barrier at ranges up to 400 meters. Their 4 resonance soldiers outgunned every other delegation's security detail in that room, by a factor that made the pre-summit security analysts visibly uncomfortable. Mara was not visibly uncomfortable. She stood at her position behind Ambassador Mwangaford's chair and watched Overlord Prime Verk Salis take his seat at the far end of the table, and she tilted her head exactly 2 degrees to the left. 64. The first 12 hours of the summit were precisely as tedious as 12 hours of galactic diplomacy sounds. I say that not as a criticism. Diplomatic tedium is load-bearing. The careful, exhausting ritual of language and precedence and agreed-upon pretense is what keeps civilizations from resolving disagreements through faster, louder methods. I have tremendous respect for tedium. I am professionally committed to tedium. But I will tell you honestly that by the time we broke for the first atmospheric rest period, the Velthri need to recalibrate their suits every 6 hours, which effectively becomes everyone's break. I had filled 4 notation pads with language that amounted to several powerful civilizations politely disagreeing about who had the right to extract mineral resources from a system that none of them had actually visited. Ambassador Mwangaford handled it with the grace of long experience. She spoke when it was useful to speak, and was silent with intention when silence was more useful. Mara stood behind her throughout, so still that twice I saw junior aides from other delegations look at her with mild surprise, as if they'd forgotten she was human and therefore animate. During the break, I went to the secondary corridor to eat something, and Mara was already there, standing with a sealed water container and what looked like an energy bar, her eyes on the corridor junction. "How are you doing?" I asked, because I am the kind of person who asks that. "Fine," she said. Then, "The Scarith resonance soldiers rotate their attention pattern every 90 seconds. 3 of them cover the main chamber. The 4th covers the corridor approach." "Is that significant?" "It leaves a 17-second window in the corridor coverage every rotation." "Should I be worried?" She looked at me for a moment. "No, I'm just noting it." I wrote it down anyway. The second session opened with what should have been a procedural motion about resource partition timelines. It turned into something else. The thing about galactic summits that the public briefings don't prepare you for is that the political tensions everyone knows about in the abstract become very specific and very physical when you put 7 civilizations in one pressurized room. You can feel the weight of old grievances. The Velthri and the Gloran have a border dispute that predates human spaceflight by several centuries, and when their delegates are seated 14 meters apart, you can see it in the micro-adjustments of their posture. The Faranath Assembly's delegates keep their collective observation nodes oriented away from the Cathari section at all times, which is their equivalent of turning their back on someone. The Scarith, for their part, behaved with the impeccable courtesy of beings who consider courtesy a demonstration of magnanimity rather than mutual respect. Overlord Prime Verk Salas spoke with great precision and great warmth, and said, in effect, that the Scarith Imperium was prepared to support the resource partition proposal, provided that the partition boundaries reflected the natural gradient of civilizational development among the summit powers. In plain language, the more developed you are by Scarith metrics, the larger your share. By Scarith metrics, the Earth delegation ranked 6th of 7. Ambassador Mwangaford's expression didn't change. She was too experienced for that. But I saw her hand on the table move just slightly, a small, controlled motion, and I recognized it from previous summits as her equivalent of taking a very deep breath. She responded with a counter-proposal that was so precisely worded, so carefully constructed, that it took 3 of the Scarith aides a full 2 minutes to realize that she just publicly dismantled the premise of Salas's argument using his own civilization's published philosophical frameworks. There was a moment in that room, one of those moments where sound almost stops, where everyone was processing what had just happened. Overlord Prime Verk Salas looked at Ambassador Mwangaford for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "The human speaks with unexpected clarity." "Ambassador," said Ambassador Mwangaford, with a tone so mild it was almost surgical, "the title is Ambassador." Another silence, longer this time. Mara behind her was perfectly still, but I noticed her weight shift, almost imperceptibly, to the balls of her feet. The incident happened on the 2nd day. I want to be very specific about the timeline, because I've been asked about it hundreds of times since, and the details matter. Day Cycle 48, Session 3. The summit had moved into the Trade Accord sub-discussions, which were being handled through a procedural relay system because the Velthri and the Gloran had requested that their direct exchanges be routed through a linguistic mediation protocol. This meant the session had 2 layers of communication running simultaneously, and the room was filled with a low-level harmonic hum from the mediation equipment. It was the kind of environment that makes you slightly drowsy if you're not careful. I caught myself fighting it twice. At 4 hours and 17 minutes into Session 3, The Faranath Assembly's secondary delegate raised a procedural objection to the framing of Clause 7 of the draft partition agreement. This was, by any reasonable standard, a minor matter. Clause 7 concerned the timeline for independent verification of territorial assessments, dry, technical, important to specialists, and approximately nobody else in the galaxy. But the Faranath delegate raised it in a way that implicitly called into question the accuracy of the Skarath Imperium's submitted territorial data. In the Faranath Assembly, this is a standard procedural move. They do it constantly. It's the equivalent of asking someone to show their work. In Skarath diplomatic culture, it is very nearly an accusation of deliberate falsification. It implies that the accused party's data cannot be trusted, which implies that the accused party's word cannot be trusted, which in Skarath civilization is roughly equivalent to challenging someone to a physical confrontation. I know this because it was in the pre-summit cultural briefing documents that I had personally archived. That briefing was 42 pages long and had been prepared by 4 xenocultural specialists. It was distributed to every member of every delegation 7 weeks before the summit. Apparently, the Faranath secondary delegate had not read page 23. Overlord Prime Verk Salas went very still. In a Skarath, that stillness is not calm. It's the opposite of calm. It's the physical state of a being who has moved past conscious processing and into something older and faster. One of his resonance soldiers stepped forward from their position along the wall. This was not protocol. Security personnel do not move during session. That's not an Earth rule, that's a Galactic Council rule. Everyone in that room knew it. The room registered it. The mediation harmonic seemed to flatten. Myra was already moving. Not running. Not reacting in any way that looked reactive. She simply changed position smoothly, as if she were adjusting her stance, and she was suddenly 2 meters closer to the center of the room and positioned between the moving resonance soldier and the main table. She was, I realized with a shock of clarity, positioned in a spot that blocked a direct approach to Ambassador Mwangaford. The resonance soldier stopped. It looked at her with compound eyes that I couldn't read, but the pause was real. A Skarath soldier, armed and moving with purpose, had stopped because a human woman was in the way. Overlord Prime Verk Salas's gaze moved from the Faranath delegate to Mara. His expression was the kind that a being wears when it encounters something that doesn't immediately classify into a known category. Move, he said. His translator rendered it simply. No temperature in the word, just a fact being stated. Myra didn't move. She stood with her hands visible, slightly out from her sides, in a posture that was technically non-threatening and practically immovable. "I'm going to need you to return your soldier to position," she said. Her voice was conversational. Genuinely conversational, the way you'd ask someone to put a dish back on the shelf. "We're in an active session. Your protective detail has addressed the Overlord Prime directly," said one of the Skarath aides, with audible scandalized outrage. "She's not wrong about the protocol," said Ambassador Mwangaford from her seat. She hadn't stood up. Her voice was the same mild, precise instrument it always was. "Galactic Council Summit Directive 14C. Security personnel remain in designated positions during active session. The Overlord Prime's soldier is out of position." Several things happened in the following 10 seconds. The Faranath delegate, who had now realized what they had accidentally started, began speaking very quickly in a tone that I recognized as a species-agnostic signal for "please let me take that back." The Gloran session chair, a being named Facilitator Morinvel, activated their authority beacon, a low pulse of blue light from the table's central node, which is the Gloran equivalent of a speaker raising their hand for silence and also for calm. The Velthri High Resonator S-Siveth made a sound through their suit's acoustic emitter that I did not recognize from any xenolinguistic database. I later had it analyzed. It turned out to be the Velthri equivalent of a deeply interested observer who has decided to remain still and watch what happens next. And Overlord Prime Verk Salas looked at Myra Akoi for a long moment. "You are the human security attachment," he said. "Sergeant First Class Myra Akoi, Earth Accord Protective Services." She still hadn't moved. "Your soldier needs to go back to the wall." "You are aware," Salas said slowly, "of the disparity between your capabilities and those of a Skarath resonance soldier." I'm aware of a lot of things, Mara said. Right now I'm aware that we're in an active session and you have a soldier out of position. Everything else is secondary to that. It was the everything else that did it, I think. Not the defiance. The Scarith understand defiance. They're a warrior civilization. Defiance is legible to them. What threw Overlord Prime Verk Solace was the prioritization. The calm, practical bracketing of the everything else. The implication that this human woman standing between an armed Scarith soldier and a room full of galactic leaders had assessed the situation, determined what mattered most, and arranged her priorities accordingly. Without fear, without performance. Just a clear-eyed woman doing her job. After 4 seconds, I counted, he said something to his resonant soldier in their own language. The soldier returned to the wall. Mara stepped back to her position, behind Ambassador Mwengaford's chair. The session resumed. I think I forgot to breathe for about 30 seconds. That should have been the incident. That should have been the story. The day a human bodyguard made a Scarith Overlord Prime blink, the session resumed, everyone went home. The humans were reevaluated upwards slightly in the invisible rankings that galactic powers keep about each other. But that was the afternoon. The summit turned deadly at 300 station time. I was asleep when the first alert went out, the one that only went to the security personnel and the senior diplomatic staff. I learned later that Mara was not asleep. Mara, based on the corridor monitoring logs that were recovered afterward, had been in the observation corridor adjacent to the summit hall for the preceding 2 hours, alone in the dark, watching something that I don't think anyone else had noticed yet. The Scarith delegation's behavior had changed. It was not obvious. I want to be very clear about that, because in the aftermath there was a great deal of discussion about missed signals and institutional failure, and whether the Galactic Council's security frameworks were adequate. Those discussions are valid and important, but the change in the Scarith delegation's behavior was not the kind of thing that standard security monitoring was calibrated to catch. It was the kind of thing you catch when you have been watching the same people for 48 hours, with the sustained, unhurried attention of someone who considers people watching to be a professional competency. What Mara noticed, and I know this because she told me afterward, sitting in the medical bay with a split lip and one arm in a temporary brace, was that the Scarith resonance soldiers had stopped rotating. For the first 47 hours, they rotated their attention in the 90-second pattern she'd identified. Precise, mechanical, the kind of pattern you maintain when you're on standard protective detail and your job is to look alert. Around 100, they stopped rotating. They were still in position, still looking forward, still performing attentiveness. But they'd stopped moving. And Mara, who'd been watching them long enough to have internalized their rhythm without consciously meaning to, felt the absence of that rhythm like a wrong note in a familiar piece of music. She went to find out why. What she found was not the summit hall. What she found, in the secondary service corridor 2 levels below the summit hall, the one that ran beneath the Scarith delegation's quarters, was 8 beings who were not the delegation's official security detail. 8 Scarith soldiers, in full combat configuration, with equipment that was very specifically not authorized for a diplomatic summit. The kind of equipment that the summit's perimeter scan had not caught because it had been disassembled and transported as components and reassembled on station after arrival. The kind of equipment that, assembled, could breach the summit hall's emergency sealing systems. It was an assassination protocol, not improvised, not reactive, something that had been planned before the summit began, using the summit as its mechanism. The Faranath Delegates Clause 7 objection had been, Myra realized in the corridor 2 levels below the summit hall, irrelevant. The incident in Session 3 had been noise. Whatever Overlord Prime Verk Solace intended to accomplish at this summit, he'd already decided he was going to accomplish it regardless of how the session went. The question was who the target was. 7 delegations, 23 senior diplomats. The summit hall at 300 was empty. They were all in their quarters. But the corridors between those quarters and the station's emergency assembly point had, as of approximately 100, been mapped and reconfigured by 8 people who knew exactly what they were doing. The alerts that the security teams received at 300 were triggered by Mara, who had spent the preceding hour and 40 minutes doing 3 things simultaneously. Staying in visual range of the 8 Scarith soldiers in the service corridor without being detected. Transmitting, via the tight beam emergency relay built into her equipment kit. A scrambled notification to the Earth Accord's orbital security liaison, and figuring out which delegation was the primary target. The answer to that last question, when she got it, was not any of the ones the Scarith Imperium's enemies would have predicted. It was the Gloran facilitator, Morinvel. Here is what I knew about facilitator Morinvel before that night. He was old by Gloran standards. He'd chaired more Galactic Council sessions than any other serving facilitator. He had a reputation for absolute impartiality that had made him simultaneously trusted by every delegation and threatening to none of them. Here is what Mara had figured out, in the corridor in the dark, by watching 8 armed soldiers and working backward from their positioning and their target map. Morinvel was not going to chair just this summit. He had been selected, in a closed council session 2 months prior, to chair the upcoming review of Scarith Imperium territorial claims. The review that, if conducted by someone with Morinvel's reputation for impartiality and his depth of procedural knowledge, had a very high probability of finding against the Scarith on at least 4 of the 7 disputed systems. Killing him at this summit, in this context with this many delegations present, would do 3 things. Remove the obstacle, send a message to every other delegation about the cost of opposing Scarith interests, and do it in a way that could be made to look like internal Gloran political violence, which would fracture the Council along already existing fault lines. It was, Mara told me afterward with the flat professional assessment of someone describing an engineering problem, a very good plan. How did you know about the territorial review? I asked. That was closed session. I read the archive documents, she said. I processed that for a moment. The archive documents were 42 pages long. I read everything, she said, as if this were a surprising thing for me to be surprised about. At 300, the alert went out. What happened in the next 90 minutes is documented in 17 separate official reports, all of which are accurate and none of which quite capture what it was like to be there. So I'm going to tell you what it was like to be there. The security response to the alert was organized chaos, which is different from plain chaos in that it has a direction, but the direction is not always immediately visible to the people inside it. I was woken by the proximity alarm in my quarters and told by the automated system to move to the nearest secure assembly point, which was the summit hall. I did. Most of the delegation support staff did. We crowded into that enormous room with its arching ceiling and its Viridian black stone table, and we tried to understand what was happening from the fragments of information that were coming through on various devices. What I knew at that point, there was a security incident. The summit was in lockdown. The delegation principals were being moved. What I did not know, where Myra was. What Myra was doing at 300, while the rest of us were moving toward the summit hall, was moving toward the 8 Scarith soldiers in the service corridor. She'd sent the alert. She'd flagged the target. She'd given the Earth Accord orbital liaison 20 minutes to coordinate with the station's Gloran security command. Now she was in the corridor with 8 soldiers and a very specific problem. The 8 soldiers knew the alert had gone out. She could tell by the change in their movement, not panic. The Scarith don't panic, but a recalibration. A mission that had been planned for 3 more hours was now compressed into whatever time they had before the lockdown systems sealed the corridor junctions. They were moving faster. The route to Morinvel's quarters ran through a junction that had exactly one approach. Myra got there first. I'm going to try to describe what happened in that junction accurately, and I'm going to acknowledge up front that my account is reconstructed from 3 sources. What Myra told me in the medical bay, the corridor sensor logs that survived the incident, and the testimony of Auxiliary Security Officer Preth, a Gloran station guard who was the first responder to arrive in that section after the alert. The junction was 3 meters wide. The service corridor ceiling was lower than the main corridors, about 3 meters. The lighting was emergency level, amber red, which the Gloran used during lockdown procedures, and which is visually difficult for species whose primary sight range sits in the near-ultraviolet spectrum. That matters. Scarith vision is primarily near-ultraviolet. Amber red emergency lighting functions approximately the way a very bright, narrow flashlight would function in a human's visual field at night. It creates glare more than illumination, and it compresses depth perception. Mara's vision is standard human, which is optimized for exactly the amber-red wavelength range. She'd chosen the junction deliberately, I realized when she explained this. Not just because it was the only approach to Morinville's corridor, but because the lighting worked in her favor. 8 soldiers against 1 person is not a situation you win on equal terms. You find the terms that aren't equal in the direction you need. She had her weapon, a standard Earth Accord protective detail sidearm, compact, high velocity, designed for close quarters. She also had the 6 flashbang equivalent devices she'd pulled from her equipment kit, which were calibrated to output frequencies that are standard in human security doctrine, but which happened to sit precisely in the range most disruptive to Scarith compound vision. She didn't fight 8 soldiers, she didn't try to, she collapsed the junction. The first device went into the approach corridor 20 meters before the junction. The second went 2 seconds later. The third triggered a resonance feedback in the corridor's structural harmonics. Mara had identified, in her 12 hours of mapping the station, that this particular corridor section had a structural resonance frequency that made the walls vibrate at approximately 700 Hz when disrupted by the right pulse frequency. 700 Hz is deeply uncomfortable for the Scarith acoustic plate system. It doesn't incapacitate them, but it disrupts the precision coordination they rely on for combat formation movement. The 4 lead soldiers, instead of moving as a precision unit, moved as 4 individuals who were experiencing significant sensory disruption and could not clearly see what was in front of them. Mara shot the first 2. Not fatally, she told me this carefully, and I believed her, but with enough kinetic impact on their dorsal plating to put them on the ground. Scarith plating hardens under direct structural threat, but it takes approximately 0.4 seconds to fully harden, and the decision about what constitutes a structural threat is made by autonomic systems that weren't designed to process disrupted vision scenarios quickly. The third and fourth went down when she dropped the floor. Not literally, but the service corridor had, as part of its Glorin construction, maintenance access panels in the floor that connected to the station's pressurization system. Mara had identified these in her first 12 hours. She'd also identified that opening 2 specific panels simultaneously created a pressure differential that, in the low gravity of this corridor section, made footing unreliable for bipedal beings whose center of mass sits significantly higher than a human's. 2.6-meter beings with their weight distributed for upright movement in standard gravity do not handle sudden floor pressure changes well. The remaining 4 soldiers, the ones who hadn't been in the lead group, stopped. They reorganized. This took about 8 seconds, which is very fast, but 8 seconds is a long time in a corridor. Mara was already at the junction's far end when the Glorin security team came through the access corridor from the direction of the main summit hall. 7 officers, armed with equipment calibrated to their own specifications. The Scarith soldiers, already disrupted and disoriented, found themselves flanked. It was over in approximately 2 minutes from first engagement. I was still in the summit hall when Auxiliary Security Officer Preth came through the main entrance and told the room, in the flat declarative tone of Glorin officers everywhere, that the security incident had been contained. The Glorin phrasing is resolved to structural integrity, which sounds anticlimactic for what had actually happened. It was 40 minutes later before anyone told us the specifics. It was another 20 minutes before Myra came into the summit hall. She had a split lip from a piece of corridor panel that had come back wrong. Her left forearm was in a temporary immobilization brace, a hairline fracture, she told me later, from an impact with a Scarith soldier who'd gotten a hand on her before the floor disruption. She had 3 small burns on her right arm that I couldn't stop looking at, the kind that come from pulse discharge splash. She walked to Ambassador M. Wangaford, who was standing near the center table with the Glorin senior security liaison and 3 other delegates who hadn't gone back to their quarters yet. She stood in front of the ambassador and said, in the same conversational tone she'd used in the session corridor 15 hours earlier, "Ma'am, the threat's been contained. Facilitator Morinville is secure. You're safe." Ambassador M. Wangaford looked at her for a long moment. The ambassador was not a demonstrative person. I had worked adjacent to her for 3 summits, and I had never seen her embrace anyone in a professional context. She put both hands on Mara's shoulders, which in xenolinguistic terms is about as expressive as that woman ever got. "You're hurt," she said. "I'm fine," said Mara. "You're not fine, you have a broken arm. Hairline fracture, mostly fine." "Sit down, Sergeant." Mara sat down. The aftermath of the summit incident is a matter of public record, or as much public record as something classified under Galactic Council Directive 9 human can be. Overlord Prime Verk Salas was removed from his position within 72 hours by the Scarith Imperium's own internal council, which suggests that the assassination plan was not universally endorsed within the Scarith power structure, and that his gamble had failed in a way that created more problems than it solved. The 8 soldiers were held by Gloran Station security and transferred to council custody. Facilitator Morinveld chaired the Scarith Territorial Review 6 months later. The council found against the Scarith on 4 of the 7 disputed systems, which was about what anyone with access to the underlying data would have predicted. Ambassador M. Wangaford presented the Earth Accord's resource partition proposal in the resumed summit session. They resumed, after 2 days, because stopping would have been a victory for whoever had ordered the attack, and it was adopted in modified form, which is about as good as adopted ever gets at a galactic summit. I saw Mara twice after that. Once in the medical bay, when I brought her a cup of something that the station dispensary called tea, and which tasted like a concept of tea rather than actual tea, and once at the shuttle terminal when we were heading back to the Nairobi Orbital Transit Hub. At the terminal, I asked her something I'd been thinking about since the junction. I asked her, when she was in that corridor in the dark with 8 soldiers moving toward her, what she was thinking about. She thought about it for a moment, a real pause, the kind where you can tell someone is actually considering the question rather than reaching for a prepared answer. "I was thinking about page 23, she said. I stared at her. "Of the pre-summit cultural briefing," she said. "The part about Scarith visual range capabilities, I kept going over it. While you were in a firefight, I had to get the lighting right. The whole thing depended on getting the lighting right." A pause. 42 pages is a lot, but it's all in there. If someone wrote it down, it means it matters. I thought about that all the way back to Earth. I thought about it for a long time after that, in the archive rooms where I work, surrounded by documents that other people generate, and that I organize and preserve because someone decided they were worth keeping. Every record matters, every observation, every note taken by someone invisible in the back of a room who doesn't stop watching. I've been an archivist for 31 years. I've sat in the back of a lot of rooms and watched a lot of things happen. I've never watched anything like Mara Akoy standing in a corridor junction, with her weight on the balls of her feet and her hands out from her sides, putting herself between 8 armed soldiers and a Gloran diplomat whose death would have fractured the galaxy. Doing it because it was her job, because she'd read the briefing documents, because she'd spent 12 hours mapping a station that wasn't built for her body, and because it did not occur to her, not even for a moment, that any of this was something she couldn't do. Not because she was reckless, not because she was fearless, but because she was a human being who had taken a problem, studied it with everything available to her, and decided that the gap between what she was and what was needed was something she could close. That's the thing about humans that the galaxy keeps not understanding. We read the briefing documents, we count the windows, we remember page 23. And when the moment comes, we close the gap.